Good morning. My name is Bonnie Anderson. I work for Montezuma County Noxious Weed Department. Today we're going to be talking about herbicides, kind of an intro to herbicides. Hopefully you guys get something out of it, and if you have any questions, you can contact me at 970-565-0580, or you can email me at BLOV as in Victor, ING at co.montezuma.co.us. Okay, so today we're just going to talk about steps for managing weeds as far as herbicide. We're not really going to dive into other mechanical methods for species or biological control or cultural. It's just mainly going to talk about the intro to herbicides. The importance of reading the label, we're going to talk about that, and then applicator safety tips. Okay, so what is integrated management? Well, integrated management is where you're combining different methods of management into one management plan. So there's different categories. There's herbicide, there's cultural, mechanical, or biological. So incorporating multiple of those methods means you're doing integrated management, which is good. You aren't able to control weeds just doing one management type like herbicide. You have to do something in addition to herbicide in order to reclaim the land to desirable or native species in the long term. Okay, so step one for weed management is correct species ID. A great app that I recommend you guys get is called Picture This. You can just get it on either your iPhone or your Android. It costs about, I think, $2 a month, or you can purchase it yearly, which is what I do. It's extremely accurate. It'll give you identification for trees, forbs, grasses, house plants even. It'll tell you if it's native, non-native. It'll give you a bunch of different common names. It's a great resource. And then if you don't have internet when you're using this app, you can just take a picture of the plant on your phone, try to get the entire plant so it can recognize the certain features and find which species it is. Save that to your gallery, and then once you get into service, you can upload it into that app, and then it will identify what species that is based off of your picture. I used to have dichotomous keys and books every time I went out to try to identify species. It was a lot of work, so this plant ID is amazing, and it is very accurate. So you need to understand which species you're dealing with in the life cycle associated with that species in order to successfully treat it with herbicide. You treat perennial plants differently than annuals. You treat grasses different than broadleafs. You treat monocultures different than annuals. So, and even different perennials might require a certain herbicide type compared to the other one. And there's resistant factors. Some annuals are very resistant to certain chemicals. So it gets kind of complex, but understanding which species you're dealing with will help you get going into the right direction. So these are your knapweeds, at least in Southwest Colorado. There's probably more out there. The one on the top left is spotted knapweed. Top right is diffuse knapweed. Bottom middle is Russian knapweed. Why does it matter? Well, the bottom picture, the Russian knapweed, is a perennial, whereas the tops are mainly annuals. You're going to treat the Russian knapweed differently. Well, you're going to manage it differently than you're going to manage those top two knapweeds. So it's good to identify which certain species of knapweed you are dealing with, because you will treat them differently. How you identify knapweeds is the bracts below the flower. I don't know if you can see my mouse. The tips of these bracts are black. That's why it's called spotted knapweed. Diffuse knapweeds have little spikes. That's how you can identify that one. Russian knapweed, it has clear bracts. So you're not identifying species based off of their flower color, because sometimes all of these species could have white flowers. Some of them could have purple flowers. It just depends which what is in the soil that they're growing out of that makes their flower color. So it's not a good practice to identify a species based off their flower color because they can vary significantly. All right, so thistles, you got the plumeless on the left, Scotch thistle upper middle, musk thistle upper right, Canada thistle bottom left, bull thistle bottom middle, and then you got Russian thistle on the bottom right. So the Canada is a perennial thistle. Russian thistle is an annual, that's your tumbleweeds. The rest are biannuals. So these all have different life cycles. The biannuals will live 2 years. The first year they germinate from seed, they'll develop into a rosette, and then the next year they'll bolt up, flower, set seed, and die. Perennials come back every single year, have an extensive root system. A lot of the perennial noxious weeds we have are allelopathic, meaning they put a certain chemical into the soil, which inhibits growth of different species. That's kind of one of their competitive advantages against our native and desirable species. Russian thistle is an annual, so you're going to be treating that differently than the rest. All right, grasses. The left is foxtail barley, and that's a perennial. It's a native, so it's not on the noxious weed list, but it can be hazardous if you have livestock. The top right is cheatgrass or downy brome. Bottom right is jointed goatgrass. So the ones on the right are both annuals. The one on the left is a perennial, so you're going to be managing these guys differently. Monocultures means that when you have one species occupying a certain area and there's no other species really surviving within that monoculture. So it's just pushing all the other species out. That's why these guys are designated as noxious weeds, because they are very invasive and they do have competitive advantages compared to some of our natives, so they can just dominate the areas once they get established. Top left is Russian knapweed, top right is hoary cress, bottom left is Canada thistle, bottom right is bindweed. And actually all of these different species might use different herbicides to actually successfully kill them. So it's good to know they're perennial, but it's also good to know which individual species they are. Annuals, these are all different annuals. You got red stem fillery, kochia, puncture vine, or some people call them goat heads, Russian thistle, cheatgrass, halogeton. Some of these annuals are more aggressive than other annuals. Some can probably just be outcompeted if you get something else established. Some you probably can't get anything to establish until you control the seed bank, especially cheatgrass and kochia. Some of these are very resistant to a lot of the herbicides like kochia. So there's different management practices for different species of annuals. So just kind of a background, if you guys don't know this, annuals germinate from seed. They'll flower, set seed, and die. So that's all in 1 year. We call certain annuals winter annuals, and this is meaning that they're germinating in the fall or early spring. And so that's like your cheatgrass, your red stem fillery, everything that you see flowering really early in the spring is a winter annual. So it probably already germinated in the fall, and that's why it's able to actually produce a flower and set seed so early in the spring. Summer annuals are like the warm season stuff. They like to germinate when it's a stable, warm condition. Like I kind of mentioned earlier, some annuals you can outcompete by planting perennial grasses, but some, if they're already established, they're going to outcompete any of the seed you put out there. Like cheatgrass, it's very aggressive. It's going to be hard to reseed anything when you got all that seed bank. And another factor is timing. If you have a winter annual, you might try to incorporate some warm season species and try to get them to germinate when that winter annual isn't germinating, get them established during the summer, and then hopefully by the time the winter annuals are germinating again, that warm season grass or forb or whatever you're putting in there will hopefully outcompete the winter annuals. But it's hard to seed, especially in this area, these summer annuals if we're in a severe drought. I mean, hopefully this year's good because we got a lot of water, irrigation. If you don't have irrigation and it's just a dry, hot summer, it's going to be hard to get these warm season species growing and established before you get the winter annuals germinating. So it's a struggle. It's not easy. It's very complex. You might have to just control the seed bank before you can work on reestablishing these desirable species back. Some annuals you can outcompete by planting perennial grasses, while others will outcompete any seeds you put out there. We just talked about this. I think this is just a duplicate. All right, biannuals. Like I said, they're going to germinate from seed and become a rosette the first year. The left picture is common mullein. The right picture is musk thistle. These are both biannuals. The next year, they're going to bolt up, flower, set seed, and die. So you can see in the bottom picture, they're flowering and they're going to set seed. So preferably managing them at this rosette stage before they get to this seed stage is what you want to focus on. You're going to choose an herbicide that's not going to injure the desirable species in the area. If there's plenty of desirable species and there's not a need to reseed, it'd be beneficial to add a pre-emergent herbicide to your mix to get control of the seed. And that's what I do for our county roadsides. Just to get ahead of these guys, there's enough grass out there, so I'll put a post-emergent herbicide, and we'll talk about this post-pre-emergent. But I'll mix a post and a pre to control the seeds to try to get ahead of this stuff. Biannuals are going to require multiple treatments and constant monitoring because they do have prolific seeds. Perennials, typically become monocultures, especially these noxious weed species. They're usually allelopathic, so they're putting some kind of chemical into the soil, which could pose issues for reseeding down the road. So once you get these guys eradicated, controlled, you might want to do a soil test before you start to reseed these areas. Most of these aren't too hard to kill as long as you use the correct herbicide at the right time. Typically, the seeds of perennials are not as viable as annuals or biannuals. So typically, once you kill the root systems, you won't need many recurring treatments as long as you get another species established in that area. But I mean, with our area, the seeds are spreading all over the place. They're spreading, the wind, the birds, the irrigation water. So it's just a good practice to always monitor your property for new noxious weed species to get it while they're little before they start killing off your natives or desirable species. Reseeding is very important for long-term management of perennials. We want to prevent those from coming back. Sometimes people will take care of their Russian knapweed monocultures, but they won't come back in and reseed. So what you're going to get next is probably a flush of kochia, Russian thistle, your annuals that are going to come up. Step 2. So what are your goals for your land? Do you want to raise crops? Do you want to have a hay field? Do you want to just have a natural area? Do you want all bare ground? Do you want a weed-free lawn and that's all you really care about? It's really important to understand what the land is going to be used for, or what the owner wants to use, do with their land for determining which herbicide you want to use. And I'll explain more about that later. Step 3 is read the label. And so before this, I'm not expecting you guys to just go to IFA after this course and be like, I know exactly what to use for this species. It's not easy. It's very complex. There's a lot of different herbicides out there. There's a lot of different brand names. It can be very confusing. What I would recommend, like when you're starting off, is getting some recommendations from local applicators or your county weed person when you're just starting off. And that way you can have an understanding of which products to look at, and then you can decide which one you actually want to use by reading the label and understanding where you can use it, where you can't use it, what are the repercussions for seeding, are there grazing restrictions, all of that stuff. So if you go on our website, montezumacounty.org, you go under departments down to weeds, I have a 2023 weed guide posted in there, and it has herbicide recommendations for a majority of the noxious weed species we have in this area. These are herbicides that I've used in the past that I know work because I follow up with these properties every single year just to make sure we're going in the right direction. There might be other products that aren't listed on there that might work just as well. And there are different generic brands for the same herbicides I may have in this book, same ingredients, but different name. There's just, depending on what store you go to, they might sell a different line of herbicides with different names. So it can get kind of confusing. If you look at the active ingredients and the percentages, that's kind of how you know where to go if you are going to a store with a different brand name. Some of the generic brands do mix the inner and active ingredients differently. They might put a different surfactant, they might not put any surfactant. It can get complex, but I'm just saying the ones I have listed on there are ones that I have experience with. I know they work. So those are just my personal recommendations, not saying anything else won't work or you shouldn't get. Okay, so that's determining your herbicide. Okay, so there are pre-emergent herbicides, there's non-selective herbicides, and there's broadleaf selective herbicides. I have an issue, we do cost share program where we reimburse landowners a portion of the cost of herbicides they purchase. And we see a lot of people just going to Walmart, purchasing Kills-All or whatever they get on the shelf. And that's a bad thing because they're really killing everything. You really need to know exactly what herbicide you should be using before you just go to a store and start buying random stuff. So pre-emergents. So pre-emergents are herbicides that kill the seed once the seed germinates. This is preventing any plant from successfully growing. There's different pre-emergents. I have it on a different list. I'll kind of give you examples. But so you're using this to control the seed bank. Sometimes you get pre-emergent herbicides mixed with post-emergent species. So post-emergent is when the plants are already growing. They're already established. So if you have a plant there and you want to kill the plant and you want to control the seeds, you're going to want a pre-emergent and a post-emergent. Non-selective herbicides are herbicides that'll kill anything they touch. So this is like your glyphosate or Roundup. They're just going to kill anything they touch. They're not necessarily going to kill the root system. So these might work good on annual species, but not really on the perennial species. What else? Vinegar. A lot of people like using the organic vinegar. Vinegar is also non-selective. It's also really not good for your soil, so I do not recommend you put vinegar on your soil. I personally use vinegar to dissolve rust off my horseshoes, and it does a great job. It'll just eat everything. So it's not going to be good for your soil. Broadleaf selectives are herbicides that are just going to hurt the broadleaf species. So they're not going to hurt your grasses. There are certain types of grasses that are considered a broadleaf. So you need to make sure that you understand, which grasses might be affected and all that. You can find that out on the label of the herbicides. But there are some very, very selective herbicides out there that'll kill certain broadleafs, but not other broadleafs. There's herbicides that'll kill every single broadleaf, but won't touch your grass. And those are generally the herbicides that we recommend is broadleaf selective. We want to kill the weeds, but we don't want to kill the grass. We want to promote the grass to grow because essentially that's what's going to prevent the weeds from coming back. And on that subject, if you have a weed problem, it's best to just reseed with some perennial grasses until you completely eradicate those weeds. Because if you're planting pollinator broadleaf species forbs and you still have a weed problem, if you go in there to use an herbicide, a broadleaf selective, you're probably going to hurt those pollinator species or broadleafs that you just planted in there. So maybe stick with grass until you completely eradicate those broadleaf weeds. Okay, so as far as the label, if you're reseeding, you need to look at the residual and the replanting interval, which is on the label. Don't expect the cashiers at the local stores that sell herbicides to know this information. Don't expect them to know really what any herbicide, don't ask them any recommendations for herbicide, because these cashiers typically aren't trained. They don't know. They might just point at an herbicide and you buy it blindly without really looking through it. That's why I say kind of have an idea of what you're looking for before you go there, and then you can start digging into the labels and see exactly what you want. If you have livestock on the pasture where you want to treat your weeds, make sure you're looking at the grazing restrictions on the label. If you're growing hay, you need to look at those restrictions on the label. If you use livestock manure from the area you want to treat, you need to make sure there aren't any restrictions using manure from a treated area with that herbicide. Or if an animal is grazing on an area that you use that herbicide, you're going to want to read the label that was used in that area, if that makes sense. Like if Milestone was used on a pasture and then they brought in these animals, 6 months later to graze on that, well, there's residual of Milestone in the plant. So if the cow eats the plant, it's not going to hurt the cow, but they will spread those herbicides through their manure. So if you use the manure on your tomato garden, it's going to kill your tomato garden because it still has that residual of Milestone. So these are things that you just need to dig down and read the label. So here's some common herbicides that I like using in Southwest Colorado. Pre-emergence, and these are strict pre-emergence. They don't have any post-emergent activity. And that's Rejuvra and Esplanade. And these are the top of the line pre-emergent. They'll give you 3 to 4 years control of the seed bank. They're amazing. Selective post-emergent with some pre-emergent. So Plateau and Imazapic do have some post-emergent activity, and they also have some pre-emergent. Be careful with these two products, Plateau and Imazapic, because they do stunt the growth of perennial grasses for a couple years, even maybe longer than a couple of years. Even at the rates they tell you in the label, they're still going to stunt that perennial grass. I know this from experience. Broadleaf selective with pre-emergent, Milestone and Tordon, Diuron probably too, but these guys, they will kill the broadleafs. They won't hurt the grass as long as you're doing the correct rates, and they will stay in the soil and somewhat control the seeds and growth of future plants. So Milestone, they actually found to have a pre-emergent for cheatgrass. So Milestone actually kills the cheatgrass seeds right when they germinate, which is cool. Broadleaf selective with little residual, Transline, Telar, Escort, Trump Card, 240, Garland, Element. Those are some that we use that don't really have a residual, that aren't going to stick around in the soil. So these herbicides, generally you can reseed pretty close to after you treat, but read the label. Non-selective herbicides with a pre-emergent, Open Site or Sahara. Sahara is a dry granule. I think they still sell it. It's pretty good. Open Site's pretty good. Non-selective with limited residual would be your glyphosate or Landmaster, which does have glyphosate in it. Okay, so read the label. One of the big things in deciding which herbicide to use is what kind of site you want to use it on. These herbicides are very site specific, meaning Milestone, you can spray on rangeland, permanent grass pastures, CRP, non-crop areas, natural areas, blah, 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 but you might not be able to use it on your potato or ag field. It's not ag labeled. Some of these you can use along your driveway or your road, but you can't use it in your front lawn. Some you can use it in your hayfield, but maybe not ag. So this is just because these species have been tested and tested, gone through many studies, and maybe they found just environmental hazard of using it in other settings. So these are the sites that it has been tested on to work well on, and these are allowable sites. Okay, it'll have a little product information at the top. See, this one's telling you where you can use it, where you can't use it, and it's also saying Escort will control annual and perennial weeds and unwanted woody plants. So that's probably meaning you're not going to want to directly spray your rose bush. Just kind of gives you some information. See, this is Escort label. Product restrictions, where you can't use it. Some of these are pages long, some aren't very long. So Escort, you cannot use on lawns, walks, driveways, tennis courts, or similar areas. A majority of these herbicides, unless they have an aquatic label, you cannot put them in any type of water, even a puddle. Certain counties or states might not allow you to use certain herbicides. They're not approved for use in those areas. So the labels will have that information on there. Looking at grazing and haying restrictions. So Escort doesn't have any grazing or haying restriction for use of rates less than 1 2/3 ounces per acre. Milestone doesn't have any restrictions on grazing or grass hay harvest following treatments. See, cutting hay too soon after weeds will reduce weed control. That goes with anything. If you're treating anything with herbicide, let it consume that herbicide and let it die before you cut it. Because if you just mow it or weed whack it right after you treat it, it might not have fully gone to the root system and it might just come right back. So that's all this is saying. Don't transfer grazing animals from areas treated with Milestone to areas where sensitive broadleaf crops are. So if you treat a hayfield with Milestone and your cows are grazing, don't take them off that hayfield and put them on an alfalfa field, because their manure will have that Milestone and it will kill the alfalfa. So this is saying let 3 days 3 days of grazing somewhere else before you can transfer them. And then it says the manure may contain enough residual to cause injury to broadleaves. So you don't want to use their manure for tomato plants of Milestone, treated with Milestone. Well, and this is more restrictions in hay or manure use. You can read through that. I mean, the label is going to tell you everything. It's going to tell you about seeding requirements. Application before seeding grasses. So it's going to give you all the information you need to know. You're just going to have to read these labels over and over again until you really understand where you can use it, where you can't use it, how long you have to wait before you reseed, how long you can use, how long you have to wait till you do reseed, and then you can apply without hurting your baby grass. Crop rotation. This is kind of what I just told you about. You don't want to, I told you about this. So if you use Milestone on a field, you're not going to want to replant that field into alfalfa until the residual is gone out of that soil, because it's just going to kill your broadleaf crops. So you need to keep it in the grass species until you fully not only control the weeds, but until the residual of the herbicides is out of the soil. So it's saying it can require 2 to 3 years after treatment with Milestone before you can turn it into a broadleaf field. Okay, crop rotation. Escort is telling you about crop rotations. A lot of these have crop rotations on their label. Environmental hazards, a milestone. Don't apply directly to water. That's common. So read the label. It's the law. There's a lot of misuse going around, and that's kind of why I'm doing this 101 presentation to kind of inform you guys about herbicides and how to use them. Don't just go to a store, blindly pick it up and start spraying everywhere, because you're misusing that herbicide, and you can also ruin it for the rest of us. I mean, that's kind of what we're running into with glyphosate. There was a lot of misuse. A lot of lawsuits are coming up probably because of those misuse. And now we might get those products pulled off the shelves because of the misuse. Okay, mode of action is another important. This is generally the active ingredient of each herbicide, and how that active ingredient is attacking the plant. Is it attacking the chlorophyll? Is it disrupting the photosynthesis? Is it just burn contact, burning the leaves when it touches it? So there's many different ways of how these herbicides are working within the plant, and those are grouped into modes of action. And now when you look at a label or the front of the bottle of an herbicide, the manufacturers are starting to put these modes of actions into group numbers on those so we can identify them. And why do they do this? Because if you use the same mode of action over and over and over again, it'll probably lead to resistance. Resistance meaning it won't kill a certain species. And then it's really hard to kill that species because it's resistant to that type of active ingredient. So generally speaking, when you're managing noxious weeds, you're going to want to use more than one different mode of action, and that's going to reduce the resistance. So, you know, there's group 2s, group 4s, group 10s, group 11s. There's many different groups. The main ones are probably 4 and 2, but you do want to make sure that you're getting 2 different active ingredients in there with different modes of action. That's not going to lead to resistance. And you can always Google which mode of action and the group number a certain herbicide is if it doesn't have it listed on the label. And that's just kind of a good thing to do before you go out and decide to buy an herbicide. Try to figure out the mode of actions of certain herbicides you're looking at and try to get 2 that have 2 different modes of actions. And sometimes these days, they're actually mixing different modes of actions into one container to prevent resistance, to make it easier for us applicators to do that. Okay, a surfactant. A surfactant is what you put with your herbicide to help the herbicide stick to the plant and get through the cell membrane of the plant. Some herbicides already have a surfactant mixed in with it, and that's something you need to figure out beforehand, because you don't want to mix another surfactant with something that already has a surfactant, because it's not going to work as well. Also, some surfactants or additives will help your pH issues. If you have too high of a pH, if it's higher than 7, you're going to have to add some hydrogen. Otherwise, that chemical is probably going to break down because of the high pH of the water. So there's some bad things that can happen. So surfactants are important. There's typically non-ionic surfactants, and then there's crop oil surfactants or just oil-based surfactants. Read the herbicides, see which one it's mainly compatible with. It also is going to be determined by which species you're trying to treat. If you're treating something that has thick, waxy leaves or fuzzy leaves like common mullein, you might want to go with a crop oil. Knapweeds or thistles, a non-ionic surfactant is just fine. So the bad thing with surfactants is that certain types are hard on insects such as bees. If a bee gets it on them, it interferes with their pheromone system, so they can't find their hive again. This is also true of Dawn soap. Some people like to put Dawn soap in their mix thinking that they're organic and it's safe. Well, Dawn soap interferes with bees' pheromones, so you do not want to use Dawn soap. These days, manufacturers are required by law to put on the labels of the surfactants that it can be harmful to insects or bees. None of the ones that are sold around here, I've never seen issues with them, with the pheromones of bees. I think a lot of our sellers are conscientious about the bee issue, so they don't sell those products. But that's just one thing to keep an eye out. Make sure that it's not going to have issues with insects or bees. And another way to address this, if you are concerned, if there's a lot of insect activity in your treatment area, do an early morning treatment or a late afternoon treatment. That's typically when the bees are not active. So that's just kind of a safe thing to do. This is what I said. If you're spraying something fuzzy or hairy or thick and waxy, you might want to use a crop oil because that's going to help it stick on it better. And it's going to prevent it from just evaporating in the sun. It's just going to hold it there longer so the plant has time to absorb it. And there's things called penetrants you can mix in with your herbicides. If you're using a pre-emergent herbicide, it's helpful to use a penetrant to assist the herbicide with binding it to the soil particles. The type that we use is called grounded. So if I'm just using a pre-emergent, I'm just going to put grounded in there because it's also going to help protect the herbicide until it can get moisture to set it into that soil. Otherwise, if you just have an herbicide sitting out there on top of the soil, the sun is just going to beat down and degrade it before it can actually get down there. So I use grounded. Helena Chemicals sells that. Other places might have different types of penetrants. Just ask them. And then do as much research as your heart desires. Whenever I do research about herbicides, I always look at the signal word. I want something that says caution or warning. I don't want any herbicides with the signal word poison because that's going to require a respirator and all kinds of stuff. And just the risk is higher using those poison herbicides. It's just not something I want to deal with. I also look at the MSDS sheet, which can be found online. I always look at the toxicity, the LD50. So that's the lethal dose at 50%, meaning it's the amount of a chemical that'll kill 50% of a population. So that's how they determine toxicity amounts of different herbicides or any chemical, even water. There's an LD50 for anything. So to put things into perspective, a lot of people are phobic about toxicity of herbicides. If you put it into perspective, look at this chart. This chart will tell you the LD50 number. And the lower the LD50 number is, that's the less, it's more toxic. So it's the less amount of a substance that's going to take to kill 50% of the population. So 1 milligram per kilogram of Botox will probably kill you. And then I have a chart that says how much 154 human needs to consume to kill 50%, to have a 50% chance of dying. So if you look at those, I mean, caffeine, you hear about, a lot of kids dying of caffeine because they're overdosing themselves. And then ibuprofen table salt. I had one of my friends as a kid who ate too much salt and got really sick. So 7 ounces of table salt could probably kill you. And then you go down to the herbicides, 12 ounces. So that's not twice the amount of salt, but significantly higher. So just putting things into perspective, I mean, if you're going to drink it, they're really not as toxic as a lot of the things we're eating every day, like caffeine, salt. Hopefully you guys aren't doing heroin, but you shouldn't. It's bad. Lactose, milk, sugar. I mean, that's pretty toxic too, looking at the numbers. And I should have put like bleach and gasoline on here too, because their LD50s are pretty low and we deal with that every single day. I don't think I have it on here, but the risk equals hazard times exposure. So So the risk of getting sunburnt outside the sun, outside the sun is the hazard. Hazard times exposure, how long are you out there? So to mitigate the risk, we put sunscreen on. And that's going to lower the risk. So what lowers the risk of these herbicides is the PPE, the personal protective equipment, the rates. Chemical companies spend millions of dollars developing these herbicides, and they test them and test them and test them to make sure there's no adverse environmental impacts. So, back in the day, they had DDT and it killed a lot of people. And that's why the EPA was created, the Environmental Protection Agency. And since that was developed, they are very strict on which chemicals they allow to be out on the market, like herbicides. So these days, really, the toxicity of herbicide is very minute. As long as you're using it correctly. Like I said, misuse of herbicides is a big issue. Probably misuse of everything. But just, look at the MSDS sheets, understand the toxicity. Really, I've been spraying for 15 years. And as long as I've never gotten sick, you just need to do the PPE, what requirements it takes. Don't spray in the wind, just common sense and follow the laws and rules and you'll be fine. And these herbicides don't hurt any of the microbial life in the soil. It's not going to hurt funguses. It's not going to hurt insects, as long as you're doing it correctly. Anything can be misused. Anything can be hurtful. You can fall off the couch and die. Like, you just need to follow the rules and it's beneficial. So use of herbicides, what you need to know. You can treat a plant species that is not listed on the label. So within these labels, it's telling you rates for certain species. Well, what if I want to kill Russian knapweed, but it's not on there, but I think the herbicide is going to be a good fit because of the active ingredient? Yeah, go for it. You can use it on a different species that's not listed on the label. The things you can't do is you cannot exceed the application rates that are listed on the label. So if it says milestone 5 to 7 ounces per acre for Canada thistle, you cannot use 8 ounces. You can't use 7.5 ounces. The maximum is 7 ounces. You cannot apply the herbicide to a site that is not approved on the label. You can't spray a potato field when it is not approved on the label because it probably causes adverse conditions on potatoes, or it just hasn't been studied enough to allow you to do that. You cannot apply herbicides in winds over 10 miles per hour. And each label might have a different wind requirement, but it's pretty typical. 10 is the maximum wind speed that you can spray. You need to look at the weather forecast before you treat. If you're going to get slammed with rain in a few hours after spraying the herbicides, you probably don't want to spray. If it's really hot outside, if it's 90 degrees and the relative humidity is really low, the plants are most likely closed up. And if you spray them with herbicide, it's going to do nothing. It's a waste of money. So you really need to wait for favorable conditions before you apply herbicide. Don't apply if it's windy and there's desirable species downwind of you, just common sense. Okay, if you're spraying in water, you need an aquatic labeled herbicide, because typically all of these herbicides will say do not spray in water, do not spray in ponds. So if you're doing that, you need an aquatic labeled. I think that's all. Okay. What rate to use? Labels will have different rates for certain species. Let's see, this is a milestone label. If you have Russian knapweed, it's saying 5 to 7 ounces per acre. And then if you also have musk thistle, it says 3 to 5 ounces per acre. 5 to 7. So if I was new and if I've never used this herbicide, I might just do 5 ounces per acre looking at both these species. But with my experience, I know that I'm going to need 7 ounces per acre to successfully kill Russian knapweed. So that's what I'm going to use. I'm going to use the max ounces per acre. And then always put a surfactant with your herbicide. They need them unless they already have some mixed in. Milestone does not have a surfactant mixed in. Spreader 90, I don't use that anymore. But typically, surfactants will have the rates, but usually I go about 12 ounces per acre for surfactant. Okay, oh wait, I'm going backwards. Okay, and then use of herbicide, what type of spray are you going to use? So this is part of calibration. Calibration means how much herbicide are you going to put in that tank that'll give you the correct rate. That'll give you 7 ounces per acre. There's a lot of different ways you can do this. It gets pretty complex with the backpack sprayer. You'll have to measure out an area, and then you spray it and you time yourself how long it takes you to spray that. And then you get that time and you spray it in a bucket. And then once that time stops, you see how full, how many gallons or whatever you sprayed. And then there's an equation to find your calibration. I have those guides of how to set that predetermined area up on our website. Typically though, if you're spot spraying, use 50 gallons per acre. That's what I've found in my experience. If you're doing like more precise spraying, like on turf, you're definitely going to have to calibrate to your speed and adjust yourself. You're not just going to be able to wing it. If you're using a sprayer that has nozzles, like on an ATV or a tractor, those nozzles are going to have certain numbers written on them. You're going to look up that nozzle number and the nozzle type, and it's going to get you an output table. It's going to tell you how many gallons per acre these nozzles are putting out. You're going to have to see, usually I go about 4 miles an hour. So you're going to have to know your speed, and you're going to have to know what pressure you're setting at your pumps. And typically it's about 40 PSI is what you usually do for spraying weeds. And so you look at that chart and it's going to tell you your output for those nozzles, your speed, and your pressure. And that's how you calibrate. And if you have any questions figuring that out, please let me know, because it's very important that you get your rates correct. PPE, every label will tell you what is required to help protect yourself, mitigate that risk. Typically, it's a long sleeve shirt, long pants, shoes, socks, waterproof gloves, and protective eyewear. They don't want you to wear hats because hats can absorb the herbicide. I have to wear a hat because the sun's always in my face and I can't see what I'm doing. So just make sure you clean your PPE. Don't clean it with your spouse's clothes or your kids' clothes. Clean it separately on hot. And then they say run another wash in between your herbicide clothes and then your kids' clothes. So that's just kind of a safe protocol to do. If you get it on you, it's really not going to hurt you, but do change clothes as soon as you can. Take a shower whenever I go spray. I'll take a shower when I get home. Make sure I get it all off of me. If you don't wear the required PPE, you are breaking the law. You got to make sure you are following these labels to the T. Okay, combining herbicides. If I want to mix another herbicide with Milestone to increase my modes of actions to prevent resistance, check the label for any known chemical incompatibility. Another thing that we do is we'll do a little sample. We'll get a jar. We'll put 2 herbicides together and see if they're super incompatible or if they're mixing fine. Another thing that you can't visually see is just if you combine 2 herbicides, sometimes if they're incompatible, they're gonna deactivate certain active ingredients, and that's nothing you can visually see. So you got to really rely on these herbicide labels to tell you what it's not going to be compatible with. Okay. How much to spray on the weed? I like putting blue dye in my tank so I can see where I've sprayed and how much I've put on a plant. I don't spray to the point where the plant is dripping off, only if it's common mullein, because that stuff is really hard to kill, but typically not. I generally try to cover at least 25% of the plant with herbicide. I usually do broadcast applications, not spot spray, because there's things you can't see and I don't have time to come back. So I'm just going to broadcast an area, make sure I get everything, and then I'm going to move on with my life. But if you are spot spraying, don't just sit there and drench it. You don't need to do that because you're probably exceeding the rate. If for some reason you just can't help yourself and you're just like spraying the crap out of a certain plant, you might increase the gallons per acre to kind of compensate for, your heavy spraying. Storage and disposal. There's certain requirements for the herbicide on storage and disposal. Check it out. Other safety things. So it's saying don't wear anything with leather or canvas because these guys absorb and retain pesticides. Always spray away from you and never walk through freshly sprayed areas. Sometimes you have to. Sometimes it's not safe to walk backwards because there's logs and there's obstacles and you're going to trip and fall. So sometimes you got to walk forward. Maybe put the irrigation boots on that are waterproof. Never spray in winds over 8 miles an hour. Legally it's 10, but really at 6 and 7, it's getting kind of hard to spray something in that wind. Spray very lightly around desirable vegetation and avoid any drift of the herbicide going towards desirable plants. Wash your hands. Don't eat where you're storing herbicide, or don't eat before washing your hands. Have an extra set of clothes in case you spill. Carry cat litter because if you do spill some herbicide, the kitty litter will absorb it pretty well. I generally tell people to keep their animals and their kids off of the area I treated for at least 4 hours until it dries. That way they're not tracking it around. The herbicides I use isn't going to hurt animals. It's not going to hurt people, but I just don't want them tracking it around. Is that all I got? Let's see. Yeah, I guess that was my last slide. What else do I have to add? It's hard when nobody's sitting here asking questions. I think that's a good intro. And then if you guys have specific questions about specific species, definitely give me a call or some local applicators around here. They're very knowledgeable. My chemical rep is named Judd Fitzgerald. He's from Helena Chemical. If you need a chemical recommendation for anything, give him a call. He is super knowledgeable. He's like a chemist. He knows all these chemicals inside and out. He's very good. His phone number is 303-913-2574. He's a great guy, very knowledgeable. Just trying to think of anything else I want to add about herbicides. Well, if you have any questions, let me know. And then if you have any suggestions on things that you would like to be hearing from, if you would like to learn, let me know. Bye.